Welcome in yet again to the double FU, the FU times two. I am Jeremy. This, is Jesse Moeller at
Hey,
JMoeller05 at
good to see you.
FF_Rebel. We are here back again for another breaking news, breaking down of what's going on today. We're talking about T. Higgins and the fact that he signed his franchise tag finally for reality football means he's going to go back and attend minicamp and be involved in off-season activities. For fantasy football, it means that we know that he's locked into probably another season of Joe Burrow and company if the team doesn't move on for him somehow in the offseason, which still could happen. But at least for now, we're going to assume that T. Higgins stays put on that franchise tag deal in Cincinnati. So, as always, Jesse, number one, how you doing? And number two, how's T. Higgins doing today after signing his deal?
Well, I hope to be doing as well as T. Higgins one day, getting a kid check like that, because that would be quite nice. Let me tell you what. I'm doing good, but yeah, not on T. Higgins level. We're working on it. We're trying to build our way up there. But in the meantime, he got a $21.8 million check today, so not bad. The way the franchise tender works for anyone that's curious who doesn't know, it's the average of the top five at the position, or 120% of what you were making last year. So if you were making, they kind of determine which one it's going to be. So if you're on a rookie deal, yeah, it's going to be closer to the top five. If you are already a veteran, it usually doesn't happen, but sometimes it happens on like Devon's an occasion. You get the boost of 120. So yeah, like it's nice for T. Higgins. Cincinnati worked out the contract. Like it all comes through. They talked about this right around draft or a little bit before, where they offered him the tender, and they give you to a certain day to sign it. And I think that day was coming up. So Higgins was like, "All right, you guys didn't trade me in the draft. I guess I'm going to be here." Like, there's worse things than being connected to Joe Burrow. So I saw a post today where someone was like, "I just pray one day he's a wide receiver one." And my question is that even good for T. Higgins? Like, where we're at with T. Higgins, because we were talking about dynasty rankings off screen, and we were just like, is he the ideal number two and not a number one? Like, that's kind of how I view T. Higgins personally. Like, I think him being the Robin to Jamar Chase's Batman, which is not a good thing. Like, it's okay to be a Robin. Like, we see this with the guys in Miami. We see this with Waddle. We see this. We'll probably see this. Yeah, and like Aaron says, it's if I can pull it up, there's Aaron was saying that it's possible he gets their extension, because this is my whole issue with us pushing up Jermaine Burton. Like, teams just don't let good wide receivers just walk, right? Like, I find it very difficult. They're like, all right, see you later, T. Higgins. We want nothing to do with you. It's all about if they make the money work. Because if they make the money work, like, I know we were hyping him up, but dude, he's day two rookie. So I'm curious where you kind of stand with T. Higgins and like the overall landscape of wide receiver. What do we do with a guy like this? Because his season high is like a little over 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns, like 70 receptions. He's never been the elite receiver in fantasy. So where do we kind of go?
Yeah,
because the situation is great. Like, you're connected to Joe Burrow, you're going to be second targets.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. Like with any of these wide receiver twos, in terms of actual NFL terms, we always wonder if they can be wide receiver ones or wide receiver ones for a team, which is usually like a top 16 wide receiver, depending on where you are stacked elsewhere in your lineup. And for me personally, I have T. Higgins as my wide receiver 16 in dynasty rankings right now. He's someone I think where if he does eventually move on, which again, the writing's still on the wall after this deal. I think it was Schefter or some point in a note that I did read. I have to double check the source, but it was like, there's no talk of long-term deal here. It's still just the 1-year franchise tag, basically. T. Higgins just agreed to sign it. So it's not necessarily any sort of additional commitment from the team here. So that's important to remember. So if next year T. Higgins does move on, he can, I think, skill-wise, become the number one on a team. Will he become the number one on a team? I don't know. There's a lot of good wide receiver ones out there already for NFL teams. Can he? Yes, it's going to depend on the situation where he goes. But I agree with you. I think it's probably more likely that he's the wide receiver 2. He's the second option in a passing game somewhere. It'd be super interesting if he went to somewhere like Baltimore and they decided to kind of go all in with T. Higgins. He becomes their wide receiver 1, but their second target on the team behind Andrews. It'd be super interesting if he went to somewhere like Pittsburgh. That was kind of the discussion and the writing on the wall. I doubt he would go in division like that. But assuming he does there, he immediately probably becomes the one the number one target, although George Pickens, we'll see what his development looks like. But yeah, I like him as a wide receiver too on an NFL team. If we're talking about my fantasy team, it's a bit of an iffy situation. He falls for me kind of in line with the Devonta Smiths, Jackson Smith and Jigbas of the world, Jalen Waddle, right? He's kind of right in that range where these guys are real life twos, but they could be a high end two, a low end one for you if they hit right in fantasy. So it's really going to depend on touchdowns, honestly. But like you mentioned, it's hard to argue with being tied to Joe Burrow for another season, for sure.
Yeah,
so,
like what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Aaron makes an interesting point in how you view these guys. Personally, I think Waddle's by far the best one. Like what Waddle can do is just
the cup shade. That's a dagger. I get it with Puka, and I know you're a Puka lover. But like, no, Cup. We ride or die with Cup. But yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at these wide receiver twos on the team that are connected to these good passers. Because last year they entirely disappointed. There was a whole strategy around buying the wide receiver twos on good offenses. They all sucked for your team. Like if you had T. Higgins, Devonta Smith, if you had Jalen Waddle, I mean, Tank Dell's kind of one exception because he was like the wide receiver one. But like outside of that, like the Houston was the only really offense that was supporting multiple guys. Outside of that, it was rough for these high end wide receiver twos that we drafted early. So it gets interesting to see if it regresses this year. I've always thought, but particularly when we were talking to Higgins being a top 5 dynasty wide receiver like a year and a half ago, this was a real discussion we were having. I think the market is realizing like, all right, these guys are pretty capped. Like you can't be a true high-end wide receiver one for fantasy in that situation. You could be good. Like we've seen Jalen Waddle be a wide receiver one before. So I think if I'm choosing between these guys, it's Waddle. He's the best one. He's done it. Higgins has always dealt with injury and like, so it needs to all come together for him. But like what he does, he's really good at what he does. Like he's a downfield jump ball specialist. Like that's what T. Higgins does really well. Like you see him. I remember last year, like Burrow chucked it up. He basically like caught it behind his back and jumped over a guy. And I was like, all right, that's not normal wide receiver stuff. This guy's really good. So I think we kind of like crap on him a little bit too much sometimes. Like he's a very good NFL wide receiver, but for fantasy, yeah, like we were talking about dynasty rankings. I have him wide receiver 26 in dynasty. But it's a giant tier of guys where I don't really know what to do with these guys. And these are the guys I'm trying to tier up from or tier down from a dynasty. So, like, if I'm in that range of picks, I'm like, just get out of that range. It's kind of the running back twos where it's just like, they're fine. But, yeah, like, they're okay to have on your team. It's just you kind of want to see more upside from them. So, it's interesting. If he does move on, it'll be a fun offseason discussion if he does end up somewhere, right? Where if he can be the wide receiver one like you're talking about, I think he's probably one of 5 or 6 wide receivers where you can make that case where it's like, all right, cool, this jumps up and then do that. But, and then if it's not Joe Burrow, that's the whole other side of the coin, right? It's like, all right, we had Joe Burrow, sweet. Now we're going to, I don't know, maybe he ends up, Vegas would be a terrible example because they have a bunch of guys. But a quarterback like that, like a Gardner Minshew, one of those guys, you'd be like, oh, this is even worse. So it's kind of tough to make a decision with him. But I think he's just a fine player. Like that's what I keep coming back to. Like he doesn't move the needle for me either way. So when we look at it in fantasy, I'm just kind of like, I don't want the T. Higgins of the world is the best way I'll phrase it. Where if I could turn them into a running back who gives me like instant production, like I would happily do that. If we're looking at T. Higgins in dynasty rankings, like he's in that round 5-ish range, so still valuable. Like it's not like he's not cheap. He still costs a lot, but you can definitely move him into other pieces. So I think he's a fun piece to play with for your teams. What is he your kind of ideal wide receiver 3 on a team build? Is that where you're at with T. Higgins?
Yeah, I tend to go. We'll see how it ends up in redraft this year. We'll see how it goes with maybe another dynasty startup or 2 this year. But in the past, I tend to go kind of heavy wide receiver early on. So I could go 1, 2, 3, rounds 1 through 3 wide receiver and end up with T. Higgins in the 3rd or the 4th if he falls. If that's the case, I have a lot of T. Higgins as my wide receiver 3. Is he ideal? I don't think so. I mean, I'm concerned about it. Like you were mentioning, his contested catch situation. We saw this a few years ago with Michael Gallup. What did Michael Gallup do? He injured himself. He wasn't the same. We saw this a few years ago in terms of this elite level, T. Higgins level. We saw this with Mike Williams. What did Mike Williams do? He continued to injure himself and was never the same. So T. Higgins is not an elite separator. He's okay. But he's not Mike Evans either, right? Mike Evans can separate. Mike Evans is just a different animal. So he's kind of between Evans and Mike Williams, and you hope that the health is there. It wasn't there last year, but if it is, he has the opportunity to put up a wide receiver one season. He's going to have the opportunity to get those end zone looks because honestly, he's the best big body option that they have there. Even at the moment, I don't think Eric All or Mike Gesicki are going to do anything from the tight end room there. And Jamar Chase is great, but Jamar Chase wins by separating. So my whole point in talking about this is that because T is an elite separator, I'm not dying to get him. I might need to move him down a few pegs in my dynasty rankings because I want elite separators at the wide receiver position. That's something I've come to recently. I want guys who can get open on their own as opposed to, going up and winning crazy contested catches. It's why I wasn't super high on Keon Coleman this season coming out, even though I have a share or two. It's why I wasn't super high on Brian Thomas Jr., although I think I know you're high on him. I think he has more separation skills, certainly than Keon Coleman. So, but these guys who go up and win contested catches, the question is, are they going to be more boom bust for fantasy? I think the answer is yes, but also are they going to be able to provide a consistent floor, even if they are boom bust? And I think the answer is no. And that's my concern with T. Higgins. So we'll see, but tied to Joe Burrow, it's pretty nice. As Aaron says, he is expensive George Pickens. I think that could be fair. And I really hate George Pickens, except George Pickens can move, right? That's the difference.
Yeah. I'm actually looking at ADP right now. They're back to back for 2024 rankings. So it's basically like, would you prefer Keenan Allen or T. Higgins? Like if you're looking at, say you're drafting between these guys, we can play a little this or that. So like if Keenan Allen's on the board and T. Higgins is on the board, who are you taking?
You talking redraft?
Yeah, for redraft.
Yeah, I'm taking T. I mean, I think Keenan Allen is that safe floor guy. But I know your love for Rome. He's good. And DJ Moore, I think, is the one there. So for me, it's T. Higgins by a lot.
What about T. Higgins or Tank Dell?
That's really interesting. I think I'd prefer T. Higgins. I think just the target competition is a little less severe in Cincy. I think Diggs is going to command targets. I've said this before. I think all three of those wide receivers neutralize themselves, and Dalton Schultz isn't going away.
All right, then let's do another one that's right in the same range. DK Metcalf or T. Higgins?
It's got to be DK. But these are the guys in Dynasty who I have right in the same tier. They're just all lumped. Devonta Smith, just all lumped into this one tier where you're not totally sure. For redraft, DK is my wide receiver 13.5 PPR. T. Higgins, wide receiver 22. So I'm significantly lower on T in redraft. But I do think long-term, he's a great play. For me in Dynasty, T. Higgins, I'm actively trying to move him on some of my teams. I bought a ton of T. Higgins in the last 2 years in terms of startups and trades. I still like the player. I don't know how it's going to sort itself out, but I'm actively trying to move him now this offseason while he has value, and maybe with this news is the perfect time.
Yeah, like he's in Dynasty, just to give you people an idea. He's valued right around where Jonathan Brooks is, and I'm telling you, if you're going to give me a chance to get Jonathan Brooks, like I'm going to send T. Higgins pack and I'm going to gift wrap him for you and say like, I love you, T, but it ain't working together. So you go enjoy T. Higgins. I'm going to go enjoy this wide receiver one for the next 2 years. Or sorry, this RB one the next 2 years. But it shows you where he's valued in range. Like I think depending on your flavor of player, because there's different type of wide receivers. Like there's the Jordan Addisons, there's the Brian Thomases, the Deebo Samuel, all drastically different wide receivers. So you could pick, or you could pick a James Cook, a Jonathan Brooks. You could do TJ Hawkinson. Like there's all of these guys in this range. So if you want to move off of T. Higgins, like I think now is a good time in Dynasty, especially now that he's locked in, even though we knew he was playing Cincinnati. He's locked in for this year. If people are worried about him, you could flip him for an asset you like more because he's valued enough where it's like, you know what? I don't mind moving off him. I mean, you could probably get a plus on top of Rashee Rice to tell you the truth if you want to go do that. So you could make stuff like that happen. So I think he's in an interesting spot in Dynasty. It's just kind of like he's valued because of the age. But if you're not going to give me the high end production, which I don't see really ever happening for him, then it's kind of where you move. But I think the market kind of tells us like we as a community don't really know what to do with him. Like he's in that glove wide receiver. It's like I guess like right here sounds like a good spot. Like he's fine on your team. He's not going to be bad, but I don't think he's going to be a difference maker for you as we all first.
I totally agree with you. I have a question for you in regards of this or that, and I think maybe this might be a little something that's maybe a bit more obvious to us, but maybe for a different reason than what I'm getting at. So let's try this out first. I think this is something that you could try in your fantasy leagues. Would you rather have T. Higgins or Tyreek Hill in Dynasty?
Dynasty, I'm taking Tyreek. Like
And tell us.
So there's not a bigger difference maker in the wide receiver position than Tyreek Hill. And I view Dynasty in like 2 to 3 year windows. We always talk about, like, when we sign these quarterbacks, I'll devalue for a second. We talk about these quarterbacks playing for 10 to 15 years. But I'm like, who's treating the market like that? Not a single person in Dynasty is treating the market like that. So for Tyreek Hill, his impact he can make for your team likely outweighs the impact T. Higgins gives you for the next 5 years. Even if, say, Tyreek Hill retires after next year, the impact you get from this year and next year is so much greater. And this is where we look at, like, I focus on WAR specifically. Tyreek Hill is going to give you multiple WAR each season. And T. Higgins, like, yeah, Aaron makes a good, like, we'll pull up his in a second. I think that's a different discussion. But what T. Higgins does is if he gives you just kind of like middling production, it's really like it's starter-ish level. That's replacement level production. That's the thing. So if he's giving me replacement level production, like, that's not doing anything for my fantasy team. So I think when we kind of shift our focus on similar to redraft, we want these guys that give us the ceiling and do that. Like, that's why personally I value Tyreek Hill. I think I have him a wide receiver 12, Tyreek Hill Dynasty. I have T. Higgins wide receiver 26. Like, there's a chasm between the two of those guys for me personally. That's why.
Yeah,
are you doing the same way?
I think where fantasy players who aren't as tapped in, and to be fair, like, I wasn't as tapped in on this. I found this a week ago. I shared this with a few people who are tapped in. They were like, I didn't know this. But apparently in July last year, Tyreek Hill in a CBS article walked back his retirement comments. He said, he was talking to his dad at the time. He wasn't totally sure, but he was contemplating his life decisions and life after football, and he wanted to be healthy and all this stuff. But Tyreek Hill has since walked back those retirement comments and is reportedly seeking an extension with the Dolphins. He said, and we've seen it, he said, I could play for another couple of years. We know that Tyreek Hill is an absolute monster in the field. He's the fastest guy in the NFL by far. He hasn't appeared to lose a step at all. He's still the same guy he always was, and he's putting up those monster seasons. So in addition to being an elite fantasy asset, he could also be doing it for a couple of different years instead of this 1 year that people have in their minds. So what I would say is go out, as Aaron suggests here, offer T for Tyreek straight up. If they balk at you, go ahead and offer T and a 26 first round pick for Tyreek straight up. I'm fine with that. Like, go get the elite asset. I wouldn't overpay right away, but if they balk at it, say, okay, well, I'll give you a first round pick. That could work in some situations. And depending on where the Tyreek Hill owner is in terms of whether they're in a rebuild or whatever. Look, if they're contending for a title, it's not going to happen. But otherwise, why not go out there and see if the guy in your league who owns Tyreek Hill thinks he's going to retire next season? That mindset, that belief is still permeated the fantasy landscape here, and it's might just not be true anymore.
Yeah, on his interview back in October, November with Brandon Marshall on I Am Athlete, he's saying if he doesn't get a deal done with Miami, like, he wants to like end his career in Miami. So like that's what his retirement thing he's talking about. So basically it sounds like he's forcing their hand because he's seen the wide receiver market continue to explode. He's like, all right, somehow I'm underpaid now, so go give me more money. So I think we're likely going to see him play more than we think expect. So yeah, if you could get him, personally, I wouldn't send 26-1. I would send a player valued as a first round pick or in that, because those picks are finite, and like if we're sending those picks out, like, you just have to be very careful. So you better know your team build, because if you're not a contender and you're sending that pick out, that could bite you in the ass real bad. So just be careful with your pick. But yeah, like, the value wise, like, definitely that's what it's gonna take for sure. So I think that's a good suggestion for sure.
Yeah. T and Devonta Smith for Tyreek Hill, smash, accept. Absolutely. Okay. So I think that's about it for T. Higgins. We like him this year, but more as a wide receiver 2, not a wide receiver 1. We're trying to move off him in Dynasty, but he's certainly fine for this season. I think he'll give you wide receiver 2 numbers if healthy, and being tied to Joe Burrow, and that offense is great. So For Jesse, which is that way. Nice. I'm Jeremy. We are the Fantasy Football Universe. You can find us everywhere. We are on Twitter. We are on YouTube, TikTok, name it, Apple Pod, Spotify, fantasyfootballuniverse.com. We've got rookie profiles. We've got redraft stuff. We're giving away Scott Fishbowl entries, Rainbow Bowl, Warrior Bowl coming up with those giveaways. So stay tuned to us on every channel all the time. We're coming out with daily content. And until next time, have a good one.